right now. So we're lucky here to have David Ulbrich with us today. David teaches at Norwich University. That's in New Hampshire, isn't it, David?
Vermont, sir.
Well, I was close. You know, we're pretty inexact here on the left coast. In Vermont, you teach the military history program, which I think Carl was one of your students, Carl Zingheim, if I'm not too wildly mistaken. David is the author of the award-winning Preparing for Victory, which was an autobiography of Thomas Holcomb, Making of the Modern Marine Corps. You won some awards. You received the 2003-2004 General Shepard Memorial Dissertation Fellowship for Marine Corps Heritage. So you've been studying the Marines, I guess, for your entire career.
Yes, since about 1994, actually.
Okay. Well, I'm really anxious to hear what you have to say about this. So I'm going to go ahead and bow out. I say I appreciate you being here. I'm going to go ahead and mute my mic. And you go ahead and take over the screen and we'll get started.
And can everyone see my screen? Can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Not yet. Still seeing you.
Oh, all right.
Lonnie's turned sideways.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it. So I have to do it on the phone. So I'm trying to. Usually it works sideways.
Now it's showing. It's showing the agenda.
Very good.
No.
All right. All right. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. My name is David Ulbrich, and I appreciate Vincent O'Hara and the Western Naval History Association for hosting us. I was supposed to give a presentation similar to this back in, what was it, March or so, but various things happened with COVID and other stuff that basically kept me from making the transcontinental trip. I suppose I'm about as far away from San Diego as possible, up here in New England, about an hour from the border with Canada. So I'm envious of Vincent, and the weather's there, and the weather in San Diego is probably wonderful. And it's nice here, but about 40 or 50 degrees. All right, so with that, we have the agenda here. A chronology, this will be a chronological talk from about 1898 into the 1940s. We'll look at personalities. We'll look at the evolution of doctrines, force structure, equipment, and missions. And then we'll want to look at the interaction of ideas and organizations. And if everyone could please mute yourself, that would be most helpful. So I think a major takeaway here is that the Marines were demonstrated remarkable foresight, pragmatism, and luck during these decades vis-a-vis amphibious capabilities and amphibious operations. So starting off in 1898, the key is the Spanish-American War. It's the birth of the Marine Corps' dual mission of base seizure and also base defense. So as a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States picked up the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island followed thereafter. And of course, you've got Samoa and Johnston Island and Palmyra Island, in addition to the other possessions in the Pacific that were controlled by the United States. And of course, by the time you get to World War I, Japan is essentially controlling other islands in Micronesia. So you have these overlapping island possessions intermingled among one another. So the Navy, the U.S. Navy, would need someone to, would need the capability to seize island bases from the Japanese if needed, and or defend against enemy attacks. Early on, of course, these bases were used for coaling stations for the U.S. Navy. Later on, they would be used as air bases and also bases of for logistical support as we move into the 20s or the 30s. So I repeat, the dual mission of the Marine Corps is not merely seizure of enemy bases. There's also a part of it that's sometimes ignored or overlooked, and that is the defense of advanced bases against enemy attacks. And we'll hear more about that in just a second. There are several Marine officers in the early 20th century who helped to promote this dual mission of advanced seizure and defense. One is Major General George Barnett. He was Commandant of the Marine Corps from 1914 to 1920. And before that, he had been involved with some of the advanced base thinking. He created a ad hoc war plans committee in 1915 with the goal of trying to fit the U.S. Marine Corps as a component into War Plan Orange. And then, of course, World War I spun up and the entire Marine Corps kind of reoriented itself towards placing Marines in Europe, if at all possible. Major General Cole and Brigadier General Williams were also instrumental in the early 20th century in sort of pushing this amphibious capability, advanced base seizure and defense. And if you read and some of the Marine Corps Gazette articles and Naval Proceedings articles in that time frame from 1900 to 1920, their names will come up frequently enough as advocates for advanced seizure and defense. And then, of course, beginning about 1906 or so, you have the creation of War Plan Orange, which this is one of the basic maps. It evolves slightly up and through 1939 or so, but essentially the United States Navy is either going to sortie from San Francisco or the West Coast or later on Hawaii, fight its way across the Central Pacific and relieve the Philippines and Guam if necessary, and then fight a major Mahanian naval battle there in the Western Pacific, or blockade Japan if necessary. That's the basis. That's the basic of the basis of War Plan Orange. And again, it goes through slight changes over time, but that's basically what they're trying to do. And so, where the Marines fit into this strategy is the Marines are going to provide the amphibious capabilities for the U.S. Navy to make this happen, not only to seize, of course, advanced bases from the Japanese, but also to hold or defend advanced bases from counterattacks. As we move into the 1920s, it gets more complicated because after World War I, the Japanese are able to take control of Micronesia, many of the islands of Micronesia. So that's the Ulbrich, the Carolines, and the Marshalls, which had been German possessions. The Japanese were able to control that because Germany lost the war. And so again, by the 1920s, we have this sort of intermingling of bases, American and Japanese islands that would eventually become bases. In the 1920s, there's an effort spearheaded by John Lejeune to establish the Marine as an amphibious force. This is coming out of World War I, where the Marines were essentially a second land army. And of course, Lejeune had commanded a division in World War I and then takes over in 1920 as Commandant of the Marine Corps. He was one of the driving forces in the vision to transition the Marines from a small wars mission, which the Marines had been performing since 1900 in Latin America and elsewhere, into an amphibious mission. Now, again, there's tension within the Marine Corps in the 1920s. There's literally a couple of cliques. There's a small wars clique, including people like Smedley Butler, and then there's the amphibious warfare clique that received John Lejeune's support. Others, of course, that buy into this amphibious mission, this amphibious mandate, would be Lieutenant Colonel Pete Ellis, well known to just about everyone who studies Marine Corps history. He writes a couple of important reports in the early 1920s. Basically, he prophesies, he predicts, he uses foresight to predict what roles the Marines might play in a potential conflict with Japan. And his predictions are remarkably accurate or applicable. And then you also have a general named Robert Dunlap, who we don't usually hear very much about. He dies, I think, in a plane crash or something in about like 1930. And he's a brigadier general that's very much involved in the late 1920s in the development of amphibious doctrine. In fact, it's been argued by Leo Doherty that if Dunlap had lived longer, if he had not died, he might have become commandant in the mid 1930s. He might have become commandant instead of Thomas Holcomb, but he passed away. But until he passed away in about 1930, he's very influential, and he's part of this clique, this ascending clique of Marines that are embracing the amphibious operation mission. Part of this is a desire to survive, a survival instinct. The Marines always seem to try to have their finger on the pulse of what U.S. military strategy or naval strategy needs, and they try to fit into that. And there's always this, particularly 1920s, 1930s, there's a justifiable paranoia among Marines that they might be subsumed into the Army or eliminated altogether, or basically relegated to their pre-1898 role as basically shipboard security and minor amphibious landing sort of operations, not a key sort of component in Marine and naval strategy. If we look at naval strategy in the Pacific, particularly in the 1920s and into the 1930s, we say a war plan's orange. So this is a model of how the Marines and Lejeune and Dunlap and Ellis and others later on in the 1930s tried to fit the Marines into that. So there's a strategy and there's a mission for the Marine Corps, an operational level mission, to conduct amphibious operations. So advance, base, seizure, and defense. Now, what the Marines need to do is they need to come up with some sort of force structure to achieve this, to execute this mission. The Marines need to come up with some sort of a doctrine to support the mission, and the Marines need to develop or procure equipment to make it happen, i.e. effective landing craft, amphibious landing craft. So this is kind of the model that I want to talk about for most of the rest of my comments. All right, so when we move into the 1930s, the Marines have to try to continue on with this force structure development and equipment, or force structure doctrine and equipment development process. And Major General John H. Russell is a driving force. He is Commandant of the Marine Corps schools in the early 1930s and becomes Commandant of the Marine Corps 1935 to 1936. And it's under his watch at the Marine Corps schools in Quantico that the Marines attempt to solve the problems of Gallipoli. And Gallipoli is this giant cautionary tale at every level, planning and the ship to shore and inland operations, naval gunfire support. There's all sorts of problems like Gallipoli. And the Marines are looking at Gallipoli and trying to determine how to solve those operational and tactical problems, the dilemmas faced by the British. Another influential Marine is Thomas Holcomb, who takes over as Commandant of the Marine Corps schools after John Russell does in 1935, serves until 1936, and then in late 1936, Holcomb becomes Commandant of the Marine Corps. Holcomb, like Russell, are both in this ascendant amphibious warfare clique in the Marine Corps. And then I will give you a couple of honorable mentions. Colonel E.B. Miller, who was an assistant commandant at the Marine Corps schools. He was the one that basically ordered the Marine Corps schools to take the full year off in 1933 to 34 to basically write a doctrinal manual. And then Colonel Holland M. Howling Mad Smith. I rank those as sort of honorable mentions in terms of the writing and the development of Marine Corps amphibious capabilities during the 1930s. Meanwhile, the Japanese are on the move. 1931, the Japanese move in, 1931 to 32, the Japanese move into Manchuria, and then by the late 1930s, 37 and so on, the Japanese are moving into China, and then as we move into 1940 and 41, the Japanese are making moves towards Southeast Asia. So there's clearly a threat there that parallels, that are actually validates and vindicates and legitimizes War Plan Orange. Meanwhile, the Japanese are occupying and slowly beginning to fortify the islands in Micronesia. All right, so here's what the Marines did in terms of adapting in the 1930s, despite pathetically low budgets. When Thomas Holcomb takes over as Marine Corps Commandant in December of 1936, the Marines had a then-year budget of $20 million, then-year dollars, 1930s dollars, and the Marines numbered about 18,000 officers and men, which was smaller than the New York City police force at the time. So despite these low budgets, the Marines are able to get several things done. Force structure. As we know, 1933, the Marines create the Fleet Marine Force, which has an obvious, division size unit that has an obvious seizure component to conduct amphibious assaults and seize islands, but there is a defensive component that they don't quite realize until later on in the 1930s, but it's there. If you read the documentations, it's seizure and defense. There is a symbiotic sort of dual nature to that mission. In terms of amphibious doctrine, the tentative manual for landing operations. That's the Bible, 1934, written at the Marine Corps schools. 2 years later, under Thomas Holcomb's watch, when he was commandant of the Marine Corps schools, the Marines write the tentative manual for defense of advanced bases, which is it's the mirror image, and it makes sense. If you can figure out how to attack an enemy held island base, then you should be able to figure out how to defend one also. So these are mirror documents of one another, and they're tentative because they haven't been tested. And the Marines are learning from lessons from Gallipoli and their own experiences in previous amphibious operations. Then we have, in late 1930s, you have equipment procurement. Now, here's what's interesting. The Marines take off-the-shelf technology from civilian designs. Andrew Jackson Higgins' Eureka boat, which is a civilian design, they adapt it. The Alligator tractor is Daniel Roebling's civilian design, and they adapt that too. That's where the pragmatism comes in here. That's where the pragmatism comes in. So, all right, so if we go back to this model I've laid out, this sort of flow chart, you have the naval strategy, the mission, doctrine, force structure, and equipment, and all this is kind of coming together for the Marines by the late 1930s, despite having low budgets and really having very limited sort of resources. The Marines are wargaming and exercising, doing exercises to fight in division-size units when they can hardly put together a brigade for any of these the training exercises they do. Now, to kind of branch out and get on a tangent here very briefly, if you look at aircraft and tanks in the 1920s and 30s, so aviation and armor, it's a much different sort of dynamic. So in aircraft and tanks, you've got a gadget, you've got a piece of equipment, you've got a vehicle or a weapon system. Aircraft and tanks that kind of floundered in World War I without finding a really substantial mission. And then what is the tank or the aircraft's mission in the 1920s and 30s? We don't know. It's what is it at the strategic level, operational level, tactical level? What are the missions? And there's ongoing debates in the Army Air Corps, and the Tank Corps, and the infantry, and the cavalry branches, and all that other stuff. They can't make up their minds. So they've got this gadget, and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. So if they don't know what the mission is at any level, how can they write doctrine? And how can they create force structure to fulfill that mission? So it's basically the tanks and the aircraft situation, 1930s, is kind of the Marine Corps model kind of turned upside down. That's one of the reasons why I say the Marines were very pragmatic. They weren't thinking about being a strategic force. They were thinking about operation and tactical force. So the Marines kind of knew their place and then plugged in capabilities to meet those needs. All right, so there's a siren going on here. So the Navy, again, picks up on what the Marines are doing, and we have the Fleet Training Publication 167, Landing Operations Doctrine 1938. That's basically cribbing its notes off the tentative manual for landing operations written by the Marines in 1934. You also have the Hepburn Board report in 1938 that lays out the need and the force structure for a defense battalion. A defense battalion is going to fulfill that base defense mandate of the dual mission of amphibious operations. Marine Corps force structure advances. You have defense battalions coming online in 1939. Defense battalions had 800 or 900 men in them, Marines in them. They were heavily armed with 5 or even 7-inch guns, 5, 6, 7-inch artillery pieces. And Marine Corps Defense Battalion's armament was about as powerful as a light cruiser. These were designed to hold Wake Island or Guam or others against a amphibious attack by the Japanese. We have the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions, at least on paper, coming online. They really aren't, in fact, until they don't actually reach division strength until 1942, but at least they're on paper as being available on the east and west coasts. Finally, the War Department, the U.S. Army, picks up on doctrine, and in 1941, the War Department adopts its own landing operations on hostile shores, which again cribs its notes from FTP 167 and cribs its notes from the Marine Corps Tentative Manual for Landing Operations. In fact, if you read the little preface or acknowledgments in FM 31-5, George Marshall says as such. Then Army Chief of Staff George Marshall says that they're drawing their ideas from the Navy and indirectly from the Marine Corps. All right, so we get to the we get to the 1930s. There are fleet training exercises going on during the 1930s, several of them, 6 or 7 of them, that go on in Puerto Rico and elsewhere. And the Marines are experimenting with landing craft, experimenting with command and control and communications. And they aren't very pretty. They're not going very well, but the Marines are conducting after-action reports and lessons learned that will pay benefits. In 1941, in New River, North Carolina, the Marines get together with the 1st Infantry Division to conduct joint training exercises in North Carolina, July 1941. So here we have then Major General Howling Mad Smith. Second is General Thomas Holcomb, Commandant Major General Thomas Holcomb. The fellow with the binoculars there is Secretary of the Navy Franklin Knox. And there is then Colonel Teddy Roosevelt Jr., who was the Assistant Division Commander of the 1st Infantry Division of the U.S. Army. And they're looking at these soldiers or Marines disembarking using a Higgins boat. Note that they don't have the bow ramp yet, but that's clearly a Higgins boat that is disembarking. Interestingly enough, the naval commander for this joint training exercise was one Ernest King, Admiral Ernest King I guess he would have been a rear admiral at the time, Ernest King, and he is even though he's kind of an unpleasant personality, Ernest King learns from this joint training exercise the importance and the inner workings of amphibious operations. So going back to this model once again, you can see how the Marines were, pragmatic. They were lucky. They were also adaptive. And as they looked at what the Navy needed, and the Marines were thinking, how could they fit at an operational or tactical level into those strategic needs in the Pacific? They created the doctrine, the force structure, and the equipment to do that. Then what we also see as we move into the conflict, there's also a feedback loop, in which as we get into World War II and the tentative manual, it's tested in reality. There's a feedback loop in which doctrine, force structure, and equipment are adapted at the operational and also at the strategic levels. And that's a whole nother talk, but I just can tell you that there is that feedback loop that is very significant. Russell Weigley, in the closing pages of his, American Way of War, basically praises the Marines and says, simply by defining the specific problems into which amphibious operations divided themselves, the Marine Corps made it evident that the problems most likely were not insoluble. So the problems of Gallipoli were most likely not insoluble. And the Corps went on to delineate many of those solutions. And so what we see here is this process that I've talked about. And then as a way of trying to maybe drive some of the conversation when we get into questions and answers. Back to the future. 1920s was an interwar year period. The Marines were transforming from a second land army in World War I and small wars operations in Latin America into an amphibious focused force with an operational mission in the Pacific. Fast forward a century, and this is where I look forward to some spirited conversation among some of the participants. 2020s, we're looking at what amounts to an interwar period. And now the Marines are transforming from a second land army and a small wars operational force in the Middle East into another amphibious focused force with an operational mission in the Pacific that fits into larger, United States strategic needs. So what are some comparisons? What are some contrasts? And I'm ready for questions and comments. And I will unshare my screen, correct?
Correct.
You want me
Yeah,
unshare?
go ahead and unshare.
Very good. All right.
There we are. Okay, great. Well, David, thank you very much. That was kind of interesting. And people, we're going to handle the question and answer period in kind of a free form anarchy fashion. In other words, go ahead and unmute your mics if you want to ask a question. And as the host, I'm going to grab my position and ask the first question, if I may. Well, actually, I have two questions. You referred to Gallipoli several times. Is this the major lesson that the Marines drew from prior amphibious operations? I mean, did they look at the German activities in the Baltic, for example?
They actually did look at some of the German operations. They looked at the German operations in Africa, the amphibious landing in Africa, but Gallipoli was the real sort of focus for lessons learned and the cautionary tale because it was big. It was a big operation, and it involved all the phases of an amphibious operation: the ship to shore, the naval gunfire support, and also ongoing inland operations. So Gallipoli was really Gallipoli had the problems they were trying to solve. Although they looked at they did look at other operations as needed.
My second question: did the Marines ever envision a mission in Europe? I mean, what would have been the effect of a Marine division at Normandy, for example, or Marines coming ashore at Norway or the Aegean? I mean, was that ever seriously
Well, the
considered?
Marines did send some troops, send a unit to Iceland in whatever, 40 or 41, I believe. But you had this division of labor between the Atlantic and the Pacific that was political and well above Thomas Holcomb's pay scale. So Marshall was going to get the Atlantic in Europe, and the Navy was going to get the Pacific. The fact is, the Marines could have landed at Normandy, and I would argue that, you know, when you look at the doctrine and the tentative manual for landing operations, and then you look at how the Army applied some of those doctrines, not just in Normandy, but in Torch and Husky and Anzio, they took some ideas that the Marines had and kind of adapted them. Certainly, it's a lot different from landing on even a big island like Okinawa, where the Marines, several divisions are landing, but the Japanese aren't going to reinforce, period. The Japanese that are there, vice landing in D-Day, where it's just the amphibious landing is the stepping off point for 11 months and 3 million later driving across France. But there were some Marines that were observers and advisors on the D-Day landing, and I found references to Thomas Holcomb. Thomas Holcomb retired in December of 1943. He was retired as a 3-star, brought back immediately as a 4-star, and he did some touring, did some inspections. And then in April of 1944, Thomas Holcomb gets appointed to become the minister to South Africa. That's a whole other story, but he's on his way to South Africa in April of 1944, and he flies over to London. And apparently he spent he spent an afternoon in May of 1944 talking with Dwight D. Eisenhower about the D-Day invasion. I know that they talked about it. I have no references to what they talked about, but I would like to think that Holcomb and Eisenhower were talking about amphibious operations. I just don't have any proof. And then of course he made his way to South Africa. So the Marines had their fingerprints, but then the Army would have also learned their own lessons in the Mediterranean that they would have applied at D-Day.
Thank you, Ed.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
What about the Russo-Japanese War? Did they look at that, or the Sino-Japanese War for some of their operations?
I'm drawing a blank of whether or not they did. I imagine, I think they did, but I can't say for sure. I'm just drawing a blank. But the Marines canceled all classes in Marine Corps schools for all the officers there for a full year. So they went into detail on lots and lots of things. That was their year. Imagine that. Imagine Quantico shutting down now to write an entire manual today. That's, imagine what that would involve. So yeah, they would have looked at a lot of different things, but primarily Gallipoli.
If I'm not mistaken, the Marines copied the ramp on the Higgins boat, the later LCVP, from the Japanese, something they saw there from one of their landing craft.
That was a young Victor Krulak, first or second lieutenant Victor Krulak in 1937 or 38 that observed that and got word back to headquarters. Yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Bud Cole in Annapolis. I was fascinated by the fact that you had an Army observer at that FIBEX in 1941. Given the predominance of the Army in the Pacific amphibious operations, did you come across any further liaison between the Marines and the Army in the late 30s while this doctrine was being developed?
Well, it wasn't. I was talking very quickly because I had a lot to cover and whatever. But I should make that clear. Then Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Assistant Division Commander of the U.S. Army's 1st Infantry Division, was not an observer. He was a commander. The 1st Infantry Division was joint training with the 1st Marine Division at New River, and they were being supported by the Atlantic Fleet, whose commander was Ernest King. So it wasn't just observing. They were the soldiers in the Big Red One were landing on the beach alongside the Marines, and that was purposeful because in July 1941, the planners are looking ahead and expecting sooner or later they might have to put, Army units on the ground in Europe or North Africa or Italy or somewhere.
Thank you.
That was the big move in 1941. Yes, sir.
I have a question. Are you familiar with the Naval War College archives? They have some good stuff from '99, including Henry Taylor's assessments of the landings in Cuba and Puerto Rico. And since Marine Corps officers were attached to the Navy anyway, wonder if there was any influence from that. I mean, he does a very harsh assessment.
Oh yeah, I'm not familiar with those particular reports, but I'm familiar with the assessments. And most of those fleet training exercises in the 1930s and even the ones earlier in the 1900s and 19-teens were had lots of problems. They weren't very good. And so there was plenty for them to learn from. Actually, where Thomas Holcomb ends up learning a lot about amphibious warfare is ironically at the Army War College, where he's a student in 1931 to 1932. And he's a full bird colonel at that point. And one of the students' group activities is to plan an amphibious assault and inland operations against Nova Scotia, of all places. Go figure, right? Nova Scotia. Well, there's about a 9-student team, and Holcomb is the senior leader on that team. They're all students, but there has to be someone in charge. And so he's planning this, and it just so happens that there is a then major George S. Patton who's on his team. So he's going to the Army War College at the same time Patton is. And so they would be as they're planning this simulated amphibious assault on Nova Scotia, they would be looking at obviously at past reports, past evaluations of fleet training exercises and other things to try to determine how best to make that landing. I'm not familiar though with the reports you're talking about, but I've read, all those fleet training exercises were a mess, a complete mess.
Could you say anything about the British context of all this? I mean, there are two sides to this. One is that the British developed a lot of the techniques and technology in 1939, 40, 41, including the larger amphibious vessels, LSTs and so on, beyond the Higgins boat and so on. And that stuff does seem to come from Britain rather than from the Marine Corps or from within the US Navy. And I wondered if you could explain why that happens. The British order something and then it's produced in large scale in the US. And the second issue that I think is interesting is the failure of the Royal Marines to develop the same kind of identity that the American Marine Corps has. It's basically playing a very secondary role throughout the war because it doesn't have the kind of mission idea that the American Marines have. But I wondered if you could talk a bit about the British side of that, because I assume the British were influential in Marine Corps thinking in 1940, 41, and they're looking quite seriously at a raiding strategy, which fits in some ways with what the Marines wanted to do in the Pacific.
Right, thank you. I got to start by saying I'm not an expert on the British side of things, so what I'm saying is does not bring, I don't have the depth of research when I talk about the US Marines, but the British certainly would be attuned to amphibious operations and projecting force onto Europe anyway. They'd be hardwired to do that. I think that by the time you get to 40, 41, you do have some definite interaction between the U.S. and the British, and they're going to be exchanging ideas, exchanging, equipment ideas, eventually exchanging, amphibious vehicles and ideas on amphibious vehicles. I don't know much more about the development of the larger amphibious craft that the British did. As for the Royal Marines, they don't break out of their sort of small elite unit kind of commando role, that may go back to personality, because you had the article or the person to talk to would be Donald Bittner. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Donald Bittner of Marine Corps Command and Staff College. He's the absolute expert on this stuff, and he's written a couple of articles in Journal of Military History maybe 2 decades ago on Royal Marines. But I think the thing is, with the US Marines, they had these personalities like John Lejeune, and they had these personalities like John Russell, and then they had very good organizers like Thomas Holcomb that were shrewd and opportunistic, and the Marines have always been hardwired to figure out a way to plug themselves into military needs, military roles, operational or strategic roles. I think it may be as much personality as anything else. I don't know if there was a dominant personality in the British Royal Marines that had the clout or the following or the lobby that John Lejeune had.
And he also had Smedley Butler's father, who in Congress during most of the 20s. Yeah.
So I don't know, Professor Maudsley, do you have any other insights, or maybe others might have some insights about the British side?
Well, 2 other insights. One is that the British, like the Americans, actually were very interested in what the Japanese were doing in China in 1937, 1938. The Japanese really are the vanguard. They're the ones who really, in some ways, do amphibious operations on a very large scale, both in the Russo-Japanese War and in the war in China. I mean, they're actually quite like Britain geographically. You know, you've got an island nation off a large continent. But the difference is, I think, is that for the British, almost in terms of pre-war thinking, why would you want to have the capability of invading Europe? You know, it's just not an obvious thing to want to be able to do. Who could have believed that in 1940 Germany would control almost all of Europe, and that therefore a raiding mission would suddenly emerge, in which you would need something like the Marine Corps, and you would need a whole lot of new technology to mount the missions, especially at a time when, I mean, I think the problem with landings after Gallipoli. I mean, Gallipoli is relatively simple because it's donkeys, right? Once you get into the 1940s, you've got vehicles. How do you get vehicles ashore? How do you supply them? How do you get tanks ashore? Those things weren't Gallipoli problems. They were very different problems. And I think whether the Marines thought about that or not, I don't know in the 30s, but the British were thinking about that very seriously in 1940 and 1941.
I would say
The
before
LCA,
let me just finish that thought and make a recommendation. Edward Dray wrote as a collection of his essays. Edward Dray, I think it's called "In Service of the Emperor." It's a collection of essays and chapters.
Oh yeah. I've read that. Mm-hmm.
On the Japanese Army, and there's a 17-page, short 17 or 18-page chapter that's the best thing I've ever written on Japanese amphibious operations. The very best. I think it's called "In Service of the Emperor" by Edward Dray, D-R-E-A. And of course, he is one of the premier experts on the Japanese Army. But that chapter is the go-to chapter on Japanese amphibious operations in China, particularly in the late 1930s. I'm sorry, there was someone else who was going to say something.
yeah, I was going to say the LCA landing craft armored was a British development. It, rather than a ramp, had an armored door on the front. And I think it, you know, as the professor implied, was so Marines could come ashore in a hostile environment with some protection, open the door, run out on the beach or whatever. The LCT followed, also a British development, landing craft tank. It was just make it bigger and give it a way to put a tank ashore. And then it was 2 tanks and 5 tanks. It got bigger and bigger. And I think all of that, when the two nations got together, Britain and the United States, was a case of, this is a great idea. We don't have the wherewithal to build that and everything else we're trying to build. And the United States said, sure, we got a whole bunch of little shipyards that can do that. We went to work.
That was the British problem, was that when they tried to build LSTs, they only built 3 of them. And so almost the entire supply of LSTs comes from the US in a simplified design. But so you had this kind of sense that the idea is kind of thought up somewhere in Whitehall. But the idea of making it an actual force, I mean, a phenomenal force of LSTs by Sicily in 1943 is very much American production.
Yeah.
Well, there was some adaptation and modification. It's a good idea brought to development, and there was an awful lot of cross-pollination. Nobody had a, what do you want to call it, a thumb on development. Everybody was involved.
I think Tony had a question. Tony Piscatelli.
Just a comment. Here in New York, the Fighting 69th provided help to the Marine Corps at Macon, Saipan, and Okinawa, and was part of the landing force there. I just wanted to wave the local flag.
Why not? Tony?
Or other questions? Sorry, I should defer to the host. So, Vincent.
I have a question.
The floor is open. So,
I have a question.
Gary.
So, sort of absent from the discussion was any mention of the role of civilian authority in shaping the mission of the Marine Corps. So I'm assuming that that's a mission based on contemporaneous yielding the floor, or really not the State Department and the Department of the Navy not really being that actively involved, and basically the military institution itself, or the Marines, basically took it upon themselves to develop and allow mission.
Well, if you look at the 1920s, you had a Republican administration, Republican Congress, and they were anti-marine, anti-military. So they started to cut the budget. And of course, you have the Great Depression hit, and the budget gets cut even more narrowly. But at the same time, you had Franklin Roosevelt take over as, being elected as president, and he was, he considered himself "we Marines." He would talk about "we Marines." So you have this. You have some civilians that are of anti-military isolation and so on, but then you have others like Franklin Delano Roosevelt that wanted to support the Marines. Of course, he couldn't support the Marines, the Navy politically because of the budgets and because of the American public opinion. But then I think one of the key people that really pushes the Marines and pushes the Navy, of course, is a landlocked congressman from Georgia named Carl Vinson. Who ends up becoming arguably one of the most powerful men in Congress for 40 years, give or take. And he will be chairman of Naval Affairs, and he will push both the Navy and the Marine agendas very, very hard. And he is aided in the 1930s by a little known Republican minority, the senior Republican minority member of Naval Affairs, a fellow named Melvin Moss, who's a progressive Republican from Minnesota. Moss was a Marine Corps reservist, a pilot in World War I, and he and Benson kind of do this 1-2 punch in naval affairs to try to push money and resources to the Marines, to the Navy, and of course Moss is very supportive of the Marines in particular. So there are people scattered in the civilian side of the federal government that support the Marine Corps. I think the Navy Department, Franklin Knox was certainly supportive of the Marine Corps, but there's also the political reality that you can't get a lot of money even in 1939 because everyone's isolationist and you're coming out of the Great Depression. So the Marines, for example, Thomas Holcomb used this concept of the Defense Battalion, naming it the Defense Battalion, to push the Marines' defensive role. Because even if most Americans didn't want to go to war and didn't want a large offensive military, at the same time, most Americans did want a good defense. So Holcomb makes a lot of publicity and a lot of marketing sort of points by pushing the concept of the Defense Battalion. So it varies, but the Marines have very little money in the late 1930s. So they're basically plodding along internally, trying to develop the doctrines, the force structure, the equipment, the capabilities. Does that help?
Well, no, but I mean, yeah, I get that. But just putting aside the whole question of resources and budgets, there's the idea of like what we might call a national war strategy. And that doesn't require huge budgets to develop, at least to think about and to basically initiate from the civilian authority. It doesn't sound like there really was, and as far as I've read about, there really was not a lot of effort put from the civilian authority into thinking about and elaborating a possible war strategy or diplomatic/war strategy with respect to the Pacific region. It doesn't seem to me.
Can I make an observation on that?
Sure.
So one of the things about the Orange plans, and they were not the official war plans. If you look at the WPLs of the day, right up to WPL 39, which was the last one written before the war, it said that the main thrust of the American military and the Navy strategy too was protection of the Caribbean. This long-term kind of entrenched idea that our real role is to protect our own hemisphere. Matter of fact, in 1946, when they issued the next WPL, and Chester Nimitz was the CNO, it started out identical. The main thrust of the United States Navy is to protect the Caribbean. I think the point to be made, and it can be translated into today too. The purpose of the official war plans are to kind of set a policy that is out there, and maybe it's for public consumption, if you want to put it that way. Whereas at the same time, you need something like the War Plan Orange effort that looks at the war you really think you're going to fight. And I think the parallel with today is we see these concepts that particularly the Marine Commandant is coming forth with EABO and LOCI and so forth, where they may not map directly to our current official op plans, war plans, but they provide this undercurrent of philosophy and evolution of thought that was really very much what the Orange War plans were.
That's fascinating. Are you saying the 1946 plan didn't even think in terms of Europe and Soviet Union and all that?
No, and I'm not,
It's
you know,
fascinating.
my work was more focused on the early years of the Pacific War and the things that led up to it. But what I found the irony was that when Fleet Admiral Nimitz became the CNO, and really the impression you get is, well, we're back to peacetime now. And I think there's maybe pertinent to the other part of the discussion is retrenchment, this kind of core isolationism that, you know, Americans go fight the war. Once we're finished, we all come home and we retreat back into our own world. But at the same time, we have to have particularly within the professional military, things that go on at war colleges and so forth, to really look at what the next battle might be. And if you look at what we're talking about now, and by the way, the analogy that you pointed out of you know, then and now is very, very accurate.
Let me say that if you want to know more about the sort of post-World War II, particularly in the Pacific, the American war plans, Navy's war plans, please consider invite Hal Friedman, Hal M. Friedman, Friedmann. He's written several books on the Navy in the Pacific, say 1945 up through 1948. He would be able to speak to the Navy in the Pacific, or the Navy and the Pacific in more detail than I can. He's a well-published author in that field. Just a thought.
I will note that JCS in 1946-47 conducted a study on what would be necessary for the Navy Marine Corps to recreate or maintain its dominance over the West and Southwest Pacific. And the plan was so expensive that it just kind of died on the vine, but they had envisioned recreating all these bases throughout the area. It was just didn't get any steam behind it.
I think you need to look at the difference between doctrine and, you know, official plans, where Nimitz is trying to not look like he's getting ready to run over anybody else, you know, having just whopped the Japanese and the Germans. He's trying to be less threatening. And then you have plans that everybody's doing in the back room, which covers all that stuff that you're really worried about.
And of course, the U.S. military, Army, Navy, all forces are about 12 million men, give or take, in 1945. And by the time 2 years later, they've lost 90% of the manpower, down to about 10% of that total by, say, 1947 or 48, somewhere in that range. So, you know, so yes, you do have to push the planning back into the back room because you certainly don't have the material to execute the plan anyway.
Well, also remember the political environment starting about 1947 with the emergence of the Air Force. Here we go on the Air Force again. But, you know, the idea we don't even need a Navy, we don't even need a Marine Corps, you know, and the revolt of the admirals and such all through that period.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
Can I ask a question about going back to the 30s again, about public relations? Because clearly, if you look at after 45, it's a lot easier. The Marines have been so important in the Pacific War. But in the 30s, is there a real attempt to attract interest in the Marine Corps? I mean, obviously, the Marine Corps actually are fighting in the Caribbean. That, you know, there's a Marine regiment in China and so on. But is there any attempt like to get into the movies, you know, to cultivate the press, to make the Marine image, to get the Marine profile boosted up?
It's interesting that you should ask. I devoted parts of several chapters to this. The Marines, since the early 1900s, since about 1900, have attempted to keep their finger on the pulse of American popular culture. And during the 1930s, the Marines were very active in cultivating public opinion. Now, of course, 1920s and the 30s, they're going to be not going to be talking about offensive operations. They're going to be talking about, hey, we're in the Great Depression. You want to go places, go to the Caribbean, go to China. Why don't you join the Marines and go to these exciting, exotic places? The other thing is the Marines do is they also target particular types of young men with particular needs. If you're looking at marketing, it's not just about presenting an image. It's about trying to figure out what appeals to what group of young men to make them want to join the Marines. So there's educational opportunities, travel opportunities, discipline. Hey, it's 3 square meals a day. So the Marines are very, very active. And this whole concept of a few good men that we see with the J. Walter Thompson Company right in the last couple of decades with the Marines and public relations, that's all very much founded earlier in the 20th century. Indeed, J. Walter Thompson, I believe, was himself a Marine in World War I. So it picks up on that. I think the other thing that's very interesting, and this is what a couple of other authors have started looking at this, but if you look at the American mentality, public mentality, we want the citizen soldier. We want Cincinnatus. We want Tom Hanks, the English teacher, to go over and save Private Ryan and then take off his uniform and go back and teach English. The citizen soldier, the volunteer soldier. The Marines are not volunteer soldiers. They're not citizen soldiers. They are a warrior elite. So despite the fact that the Marine Corps has an image that runs contrary to, kind of the American mentality about the use of a standing professional force, the Marines still have this conduct this love affair with large segments of the American public. And that's something that's going on in the 1920s and 30s to the best the Marines can do. Thomas Holcomb, for example, in the late 1930s would sacrifice valuable budget money to send, a Marine squadron of airplanes to maybe the Florida State Fair in Miami or wherever, so they could fly at the air show, just wave the flag. So the Marines were very, very good. And Thomas Holcomb, while he was not the outspoken sort of, he doesn't cut the figure of like Howling Mad Smith or, Red Mike Edson or, Evans Carlson. He's acutely aware of how to continue to punch the buttons in the American public and especially those young men that want to become Marines, that need to become Marines. How do you affect that need for people to join? Hope that helps.
True today too, isn't it? It's still true today.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, they have a public relations NCO in every platoon, right?
It goes more than that. You cannot advance. If you're a Marine major, you need to do your turn in Marine Corps recruitment, in a Marine Corps recruitment command. And if you don't, you will not advance beyond major if you're not doing a good job. And that is an absolute priority and an absolute priority in the Marines. So and so it's
same concept killed a lot of Army officers.
Yeah. Well, the Army doesn't have the same attitude about, honestly, they don't have the same attitude about recruitment. The Marines do.
I'll let you anything.
Well,
I wonder if they liked aliens.
Professor Tengridi, I believe you had your hand up. Sam.
Oh, you're one of the few people who called me professor. Couple of things. I dropped offline for a while due to technical problems. So someone may have talked about this, but I have a comment and a question.
Yes, sir.
Because one is about the Marine Corps and the Royal Marines. I think, and you might ponder this, I think the fact that the Marine Corps fought on land in World War I as a division or as a unit puts it in a category very different than the Royal Marines. Royal Marines never had that sort of experience where they were individually cited in news reports and stuff as fighting as a unit in that way. So I think that helped the Marines quite a lot in their future decision. Also, another comment about Gallipoli. I've taken a really good look at Gallipoli, and you know, the ship to shore movement and the maritime movement actually went quite well for all things for the experience, and even the strategic planning as far as a feint on Asia Minor that drew off a number of the Turkish forces, then commanded by the Germans, but Turkish forces, and that actually went quite. It's when you got to the actual land combat and trying to drive the Turks out of their prepared trench areas that the land combat almost became like the Western Front. That's where you had an inability of the British and Commonwealth soldiers to push the Turks off. So it's interesting. It's interesting because Churchill got fired, and a lot of things happened politically within Britain. You had a committee, you know, the equivalent of a congressional committee, a parliamentary committee to assess blame, find out who screwed up here. But in reality, the actual screw up really wasn't the amphibious operations per se, except one area, and this is my question for you, is about Marine Corps and air power. I mean, the Marines seem to have set up for their amphibious operations their concept of the use of close air support. The Army never seemed to. Did the Army do something equivalent for that and thinking about Normandy and that, or they just didn't really focus on it? I mean, they had so much. Army Air Corps wanted to do strategic bombing, but I wonder if you could talk about the contrast and how the Marines thought of air power and amphibious operations as opposed to the Army adopting some of the Marine Corps things and they're thinking about air power. What do you know about that? And I mention that because the Brits were completely ineffective in using air spotting in Gallipoli. They could have done much better, and they didn't.
That's really complicated. I think the tentative manual for landing operations does outline the use of what we would call today close air support, and also outlines the use of tanks. It touches on tanks. I've had a couple of former students at Norwich University that have written articles on tanks and amphibious operations, which are, you know, I think are interesting. I think in terms of the tentative manual, it's early on, it's 1934. And so it's still a nascent sort of approach. I believe that, you know, during the operations in the Pacific, certainly there was an acknowledgement of the need to establish air supremacy. So then you could provide air support, or maybe, I don't know which is the chicken or which is the egg, but the Marines knew this, and you see that certainly over Guadalcanal, where the Americans and the Japanese are fighting back and forth. You know, every day or so, the Japanese were bombing Guadalcanal. I think by the time you get to certainly Torch, Sicily, and so on, there was an understanding that there needed to be air supremacy. And once you have air supremacy against enemy fighter interceptors and so on, then the American aircraft can certainly provide what amounts to close air support. To turn it inside out, I think the best book on this is At the Water's Edge by Theodore Gatchell, who argues that if you don't have naval supremacy, you don't have control of the ocean, the waters near an amphibious assault, and you don't have control of air power or control of the air, it's, you know, an amphibious assault may not work. So Theodore Gatchell's book, that's now 20 years old anyway, and it's called At the Water's Edge. And that's really a very good way to understand the use of air power and the importance of air power in terms of amphibious operations, but you're looking at it from the defensive side. I think by the time you get to Normandy, the United States had not just air superiority, the United States had air supremacy at Normandy. I mean, there weren't any German airplanes flying around to make a difference. And even then, even with using strategic bombing, strategic bombing assets at Normandy, the U.S. Army Air Force still couldn't take out a number of the German coastal defenses. But that's another conversation. Did I answer your question, sir, or at least talk around it anyway?
My impression was that the sort of Marine Corps' interest in aviation goes back to the Caribbean, and it's kind of, this is like in the 20s and 30s, when it's kind of essentially a counterinsurgency role, rather than an invasion role. It's different from the mission in the Pacific. I mean, in a way, it's hard to imagine how the Marines could use aviation to take an island in the Pacific in the 1930s or 1920s. But you can see that there being an important role in the Dominican Republic or whatever.
China, excuse me for interrupting, in 1927, they sent a detachment of airplanes to the Tianjin area to support the 4th Marines in China.
There's definite use of close air support and scouting and reconnaissance and that sort of thing in Latin America. I believe Tony Piscatelli had a question.
No, not a question, but a comment. The close air support starts, yes, in the Dominican Republic, but it becomes more of a softening effect to support naval fires until you get to Korea. Korea, you see real close air support where it's air to ground, protecting Marines and enforcing it. So you've got that dichotomy that you got to look at as it progresses into its or morphs into its current state.
Thank you.
The Marines do a much better job. I can speak from Vietnam. The Air Force bombed from 5,000 feet. The Navy bombed from 2,000 feet. And the Marine Corps got down in the ditch with them and dropped bombs.
We're here.
And I think it's also the development of Marine, the MAGTAF concept, the Marine Air Ground Task Force, which is usually credited to starting in the 1960s. But I've argued in a couple of my publications that you actually see a Marine Air Ground Task Force concept in not name, but in concept. And if it looks like a duck and sounds like a duck, it is a duck, beginning as a result of Guadalcanal. As you have Marine Corps, the Marine Corps commander who is going to take over as an independent commander during inland operations. So the Navy commands the ship to shore movement. Once the Marines have established their beachhead, then the Marine commander, the division commander, let's say, or whomever, a Corps commander, is going to take over inland operations, and that person's going to control the logistics, the ground forces, and the air assets during those inland operations. Particularly when we see something like a longer fight, like at Peleliu or Okinawa or Iwo Jima or Saipan. When something's over in 4 days, that's a little bit different. But those other operations go on for weeks and weeks.
I had a question, guys.
Yes.
If I could switch subject back to the interwar period. Could you comment on the impact of the Marine Corps annual amphibious problem? They started in doing some research during that period. And I think it was like 33, 34. They started coming up with an annual amphibious problem every year, which I gather was kind of intended to be somewhat similar to the Navy's fleet problem, where you'd focus on a specific landing in a particular place and so on, and all the issues that they have with it. And I know that those were basically map exercises and so forth, rather than the real physical exercises. But reading through this is kind of interesting, and the choice of the islands they picked is kind of eerie. They're almost all the islands of World War II. So it would seem initially that they had done a lot of research on each individual island problem long before World War II. But my question is, did that really have much impact on the development of amphibious doctrine and or how they were going to interface with the Navy and others in doing this?
The short answer is yes. And of course, in other words, if you're looking at those amphibious problems and the map exercises with the Pacific Islands, that's going to go back to the 1920s, early 1920s with Pete Ellis. Pete Ellis goes island. He goes and visits some of those islands himself. He's writing reports. He's reporting back. Maybe he's a spy. Who knows? All that stuff is all sort of shrouded in controversy and so on. But I think that is, and that the map exercises would also involve understanding the terrain, and there's a course I teach, and Dr. Piscatelli, Tony Piscatelli also teaches it on amphibious warfare at Norwich. And one of the articles we have people read is an article about the influence of environment on everything. And then we apply that to geography and we apply that to amphibious warfare. But, there's certain geographical features that can negate and can, deter even the best planned amphibious operations. So I think that all those amphibious problems are all kind of fitting in. You've got the map problems, you've got the fleet training exercises, you've got the tentative manuals. The Marines are putting on, in many ways, purposefully or by accident, but I think purposely, this sort of full court press to understand the entire process of amphibious tactics, amphibious doctrine, amphibious operations, equipment, force structure. It's actually it's very, very impressive, especially when they're kind of hiding off in the corner and they're not being funded, and they're pretty much quietly doing this.
But that's why they're so interested in the alligator, is because they already knew about the reefs that they had to cross. And then there's deep water again. You can't use a landing craft.
And they're pragmatic. They stumble on these civilian designs, and then give them military applications. So it's I don't know. I end up sounding like very much an apologist or even a cheerleader for Marine Corps during the interwar years, but in retrospect, they were, as I said, pragmatic and lucky.
They were a successful organization for a reason, weren't they?
They planned well. If you look at the Japanese, who we all acknowledge were one of the beginners and developers of the amphibious process, they're building amphibious tanks, which are nice. Being a tanker, I like tanks, but it doesn't help you get a lot of people ashore. Getting your tanks ashore and the infantry can't get there is a significant issue. So, Marines got it right. They put the alligator there, and then later on they worried about putting guns and turrets and crap on them.
Well, I think the other thing about the Japanese, and this is what comes out in that chapter by Edward Dre, I think it's In Service of the Emperor. It's a collection. The title is In Service of the Emperor. It's a collection of his essays and chapters and such on the Japanese Army. He says the Japanese key was not to conduct an amphibious assault directly against a fortified beach. They went 20, 30 miles down the coast or down the river and landed there, did so safely, and it was a landing, not an assault, a landing, got everything on shore, and then tracked back up the coastline to attack, the fortified position. So, the Japanese weren't doing combat assaults per se, not like the Marines at Tarawa, not like the Marines, or the Army, U.S. Army at Normandy. They were actually being quite clever about it. Why take a chance? Go 20 miles down the coast and come back on land.
Yeah, it works when you can do that.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, if you're talking about Tarawa, you can't do that. Tarawa's this tiny little island. You're up against it. Other questions or comments? If there's anyone else, we've had a variety of comments from a bunch of people. Is there anyone else that hasn't spoken yet that wants to ask something or say something?
Could I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Dan Rogers in San Antonio at the moment. I wanted to ask you about what you think about the Navy's relationship, especially Ernest King's relationship to this evolving amphibious doctrine based on the selection of Kelly Turner to be the first on-the-scene amphibious commander in the Southwest Pacific.
That's very interesting. No one's written a good biography of Richmond, Kelly, Terrible Turner. There is a book by David Dyer, somebody, or I think it's Amphibians Came to Conquer or something.
He was another admiral.
Yeah, it's basically excerpts of his oral history or his own letters. It's not really a biography. It's more like an autobiography. But of course, Richmond Kelly Terrible Turner was brilliant, and he let you know it. He thought he knew how to fight land operations. I'm not a big fan. I've written in my book and another article on Turner's activities and support at Guadalcanal. And I think that Turner was brilliant. He was also a very good logistician, but his personality and his ego and his desire to fill power vacuums whenever he could was problematic. In October 1942, Thomas Holcomb travels 25,000 miles round trip to Guadalcanal to visit Vandegrift and company. And while he's there in October of 1942, Holcomb and Vandegrift go to Noumea, and Halsey's taken over by then. And so they meet with Halsey and Fletcher and Turner, and they talk about this command relationship, because until then, Turner was ordering and trying to direct Vandegrift in his ground operations on Guadalcanal. And this isn't just the ship to shore. This is 2 months into it, where he's got his perimeter and he's fighting, battalion and brigade size, sort of operations. And at that meeting in October 1942, Holcomb, as Commandant of the Marine Corps, basically argues that no, Turner has no business, a naval officer has no business telling a Marine or even an Army officer how to fight inland operations. He's not trained for it. He doesn't know about it. And that's where they create this sort of division of labor that, during the ship to shore and initial landing, the naval commander's in charge. But once that beachhead is established and the Army or the Marine Corps moves inland operations, then that ground commander, that Army or Marine Corps commander gets autonomy in terms of what he wants to do on the ground operations. So I think that the other thing is I think there needs to be a good biography on Turner. I stumbled onto, at the Naval History and Heritage Command many years ago, I stumbled onto about 35 Hallinger boxes of Turner's personal papers there. And no one has really delved into that. And there needs to be a good biography of Turner. And it needs to be an honest biography, because Turner also seems to rise above. You've got Gormley getting in trouble after Guadalcanal. He gets replaced by Halsey. Of course, Fletcher gets beat up by the historians. John Lundstrom, of course, has resuscitated Fletcher to a great degree. But Turner seems to have escaped all criticism. And I think that's partially his own doing. But he bears some blame. All I got to say is the perfect place, and to branch out a little bit later in the war, the perfect place for General Howling Mad Smith is to be working with Terrible Turner, because those two personalities would just go at it, and they were born to be arguing with each other.
I mean, there was still some pretty bad operational confusion, in my opinion, at Tarawa, because Turner insisted on keeping control of the reserve, the 6 Marines. And when Julian Smith needed him pretty quickly there on the first day, D-Day, he had to go through an arduous process of going to Admiral Hill, his local Navy commander, up to Turner and Howlin' Mad at the same time before he could get what he needed, and it seems like something should have been addressed before that point.
Well, it was addressed in October 1942. It doesn't become part of Navy policy, command structure policy, until about 1944. It takes some months to kind of filter in, but it was a big, important, very important step. But of course, Turner didn't want to surrender control. The guy was, in my opinion, a control freak. And he thought he knew how to do everything better than everybody else. Now, he was brilliant. He was in charge of the War Plans Division and Navy before the war. Absolutely brilliant guy, but he was not interested in sharing power, and he was imperialistic. Go ahead. Mr. Cole.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. When I went through amphibious warfare school in 1966, we used that 1944 pub that was still in use. I'll also note, going back to peacetime in the teens and 20s and probably the early 30s, the Marine Corps was so small that we see the same thing we see today, which is the commandant says, and there's no argument after that. You don't have a bunch of generals and lower ranking guys running off to Congress on their own to try to sell some alternative plan.
Just getting back to Turner, the interesting thing about him in my mind is that he was actually a protege of Stark at war plans, and on the basis of him being a very strong advocate of Europe first. This is prior to the war. And I don't know if that's on the basis of conviction or ambition, being that Stark was the head at the time. But it's just interesting to me that this person would, you know, of course, that ran totally contrary to King's perception and his ideas about how he wanted to run the war. So it's interesting to me that this very strong European firster got this sort of plum assignment out the door. So I don't really know how that happened. I'm just curious if anybody does know.
It's partly because he was involved. I mean, he was compromised by the intelligence failure of Pearl Harbor, for which he, I think, it was the way in which he channeled information was one of the reasons why Pearl Harbor developed as it did. He's also very lucky that he survived Savo Island, because he's ultimately responsible for a major, in partly for a major naval defeat. But I think also Turner's a very good friend of Spruance's. Spruance and Turner were in the War College together, and I think Spruance supported him later on in the war. I'm also just saying I have to leave just now because my wife is calling me to dinner, and I really have to stop. But Professor Ulbrich, that was really a very interesting talk, and maybe I learned a lot from it. And I think everything you said was wholly convincing. But thanks a lot. So everyone, it was and Vince, thanks a lot for a really good session.
Evan, it's my pleasure.
Cheerio.
Don't be surprised if I come to you, Evan, and ask you to do this. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
If Vince, this is Don Patton.
Don.
I am not a naval historian, but I have these observations. Halsey was a student at the Army War College. I don't know if he was a classmate of Patton, but they were about the same time. Would it be considered that Halsey's influence at the Army War College had a later impact on his decision-making with things like you're talking about on naval landing operations?
I think so, yes. You only have a few officers that go to both Army and Navy War College. And of course, Holcomb's one of those. I think Spruance goes to both, Halsey goes to both. And I think that the cross-fertilization between the two branches was absolutely invaluable. The other thing is the Naval War College tended to be thinking about diplomacy and strategy at this very sort of high level, whereas the Army War College would have class projects like invading Nova Scotia, landing on Nova Scotia, that were, I wouldn't say tactical, but sort of operational, strategic, sort of nuts and bolts. And just that Halsey would have rubbed elbows with Army officers that would have later been general officers, obviously, in World War II. I think it would have benefited him. It's also a chance to take a year away from the line and think critically and in depth and thoughtfully about war making. It's I don't know. So I'm sure it did. I don't know enough about Halsey's career, though, to be able to speak in specific detail. I just know what it did for Thomas Holcomb's understanding of war making and inter-service relations and planning, his experience at the War College.
I'd make the observation that Halsey was the first joint task force commander. I mean, he understood and came up with the concept that we now use when we talk about joint task forces. when he got to Noumea, he basically took a look around at what Gormley was doing and says, this is going nowhere. He immediately moved the staff ashore, brought in Army people, brought in a wider range of staff so that he could coordinate everything across that area. And he was a very collaborative sort of leader in that sense. Now, Halsey was a terrible tactical commander at sea. Well, I think we recognize that. But his true genius and the reason we ought to remember Halsey for anything is the way he managed that theater when he took over, and the way he did it by balancing the joint forces, brought the air forces, brought everybody in together and centrally managed that pretty much like we would do today under joint doctrine.
Yeah. If I could, I want to just show one quick slide. I'm going to share my screen again, just very quickly, and then we'll take another question here. This is a part of another PowerPoint that I developed, but if you look at FTP 167 in 1934, and it isn't somehow the spacing isn't working right, but under 1938, the Commander-in-Chief Fleet or Theater Forces, so that would be Gormley, Commander Naval Task Force would have been at Guadalcanal would have been Fletcher, Commander Navy Joint Expeditionary Force would have been Turner, and then the Commander Marine Corps Army, Marine Corps in this case, would have been Vandergrift. That's the chain of command. And then as a result of this conversation with Holcomb and Halsey and company in October 1942, by the time you get up to 1944, you have FTP 143A, where once you're in, once the inland operations are starting, you've got the Commander-in-Chief Theater Forces, Commander-in-Chief Naval Task Force, but then the Navy commander, in this case, Turner, for example, or Vandergrift would be co-equals. They would be co-equals. So that's really where the reform comes in, just as just to put it on the screen so everyone can visualize what we're talking about. Let me unshare my screen here. Any other questions?
Ultimately, once the General Vandergrift or whatever is ashore, he shouldn't have to be working through the naval commander at all.
No.
He should be working with the overall area commander.
Yes, absolutely.